Tucker Carlson introduces the interview, which took place on February 6, 2024, around 7 p.m. at the Kremlin. The interview primarily focuses on the ongoing war in Ukraine, its origins, current status, and potential outcomes. Carlson mentions that at the beginning of the interview, he asked Putin why he initiated the conflict and if he felt threatened. Putin responded with a lengthy historical explanation dating back to the 8th century, which initially seemed like filibustering to Carlson and his team. However, they later concluded that Putin's sincerity was evident, despite interruptions. Putin believes Russia has historical claims to parts of western Ukraine, and Carlson urges viewers to consider his perspective sincerely. Tucker Carlson asks Vladimir Putin about his previous statement regarding the possibility of a surprise attack by the United States on Russia. Putin responds by clarifying that he didn't explicitly state that the U.S. would launch a surprise strike. He then begins to provide a historical narrative, tracing Russia's relationship with Ukraine back to the establishment of the Russian state in 862. Putin discusses various significant events in Russian history, including the baptism of Russia in 988 and the subsequent fragmentation of the state. He then elaborates on the Polish oppression of Ukraine in the 13th century and explains how the people of Ukraine eventually turned to Moscow for protection. Putin provides historical documents and references to support his claims. Despite Tucker Carlson's initial skepticism about the relevance of this historical context to the present conflict, Putin insists on providing this background to illustrate Russia's historical ties to Ukraine. Putin discusses the historical manipulation of Ukrainian identity by various external forces, particularly the Austrian General Staff before World War I. He explains that the idea of Ukrainian independence was propagated to weaken potential enemies and secure favorable conditions for Austria in the border area. Putin emphasizes that despite the emergence of theorists advocating for Ukrainian independence, they still insisted on maintaining a good relationship with Russia. He then delves into the events following the 1917 revolution, including the Bolsheviks' efforts to restore statehood and the subsequent civil war, including hostilities with Poland. Putin highlights the peace treaty with Poland in 1921 and the return of territories to Poland, which were later revisited due to Poland's collaboration with Hitler. He references Hitler's demands for the return of the Danzig Corridor and Poland's refusal, leading to collaboration with Hitler and the partitioning of Czechoslovakia. Ultimately, Putin suggests that certain parts of Ukraine, particularly eastern Ukraine, have historically been aligned with Russia for hundreds of years. In this exchange, Tucker Carlson questions Putin about why he didn't take control of certain territories, particularly when he became president 24 years ago, given Russia's nuclear capabilities and their historical claims. Putin responds by providing historical context, emphasizing Poland's collaboration with Hitler before World War II and their refusal to yield to Hitler's demands, which ultimately led to the war's outbreak. He mentions Soviet plans to transit troops through Polish territory to aid Czechoslovakia, which were rejected. Putin then discusses the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which designated Western Ukraine as part of Russia's territory after the war. He explains how the Soviet Union established Soviet Ukraine, incorporating territories that historically had no connection to Ukraine. Putin highlights Lenin's decision to transfer these lands to Ukraine and mentions the inclusion of the Black Sea region, which historically had no ties to Ukraine. Overall, Putin provides historical justifications for Russia's claims to certain territories. Tucker Carlson acknowledges Putin's extensive knowledge of the region and questions why Putin didn't argue earlier during his presidency that Ukraine wasn't a genuine country. Putin responds by highlighting that the Soviet Union was given territory, including the Black Sea region, which historically didn't belong to it. He mentions the term New Russia, or Novorossiya, used for these territories received after Russo-Turkish wars. Putin then explains how Lenin established Ukraine within the Soviet Union, and the Ukrainian Soviet Republic developed as part of the USSR due to policies of indigenization. He notes that similar policies were implemented in other Soviet republics to promote national languages and cultures.
Putin points out that after World War II, Ukraine received additional lands previously belonging to Poland, Hungary, and Romania. He concludes by asserting that Ukraine, shaped at Stalin's will, is an artificial state.
Tucker Carlson asks Putin about Hungary's right to reclaim its land from Ukraine and whether other nations have the right to revert to their 1654 borders. Putin responds by mentioning the historical context under Stalin's regime, suggesting that nations might feel justified in reclaiming lands lost during that period. He implies that while such claims may not have a legal basis, they are understandable given past injustices. Tucker then inquires if Putin has conveyed to Viktor Orban of Hungary that they can reclaim part of Ukraine. Putin denies ever having such conversations with Orban and explains that the desire to reclaim historical lands often comes from the local population, citing an anecdote from his visit to Western Ukraine in the 1980s, where he encountered Hungarian communities preserving their language and culture. He emphasizes that these communities identify as Hungarians and may feel infringed upon when their rights are violated. Tucker Carlson acknowledges frustrations among nations regarding redrawn borders, including concerns about Transylvania. He notes that Putin didn't publicly make the case about Ukraine's status until 2 years ago, and refers to Putin's previous statements about feeling a physical threat from the West, including NATO, which prompted Russia's actions. Putin responds by tracing the establishment of Soviet Ukraine and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. He explains that Russia had generously bestowed resources on Ukraine, assuming commonalities in language, family ties, culture, history, and faith would foster good relations. Putin highlights the expectation of cooperation with the West after the Soviet Union's collapse, but notes that this was not fully realized due to geopolitical dynamics. He mentions the proposal by German politician Egon Bahr for a new security system in Europe, including Russia, to prevent tensions akin to the Cold War, but this suggestion was not heeded. Putin concludes by stating that events unfolded as predicted by Bahr, despite being ignored at the time. Tucker Carlson mentions the common belief in America that relations between Russia and the United States would improve after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the opposite occurred. He questions Putin about why he believes this happened, especially considering the West's seeming lack of fear of a strong China. Putin responds by stating that the West is indeed more afraid of a strong China due to its population and economic growth. He discusses Russia's expectations of being welcomed into the global community after 1991, but notes the expansion of NATO eastward, contrary to promises made. Putin expresses frustration at the lack of negotiation and dialogue regarding Russia's concerns and highlights instances such as the conflict in Yugoslavia, where Russia felt its voice was disregarded. He mentions Yeltsin's support for Serbia and subsequent condemnation by the West, which led to a breakdown in relations. Putin emphasizes the need for constructive engagement rather than unilateral actions. Putin expresses a desire to reopen the door of cooperation between Russia and the West, which he felt was previously closed despite efforts. He recounts a conversation with outgoing President Bill Clinton, where he asked about the possibility of Russia joining NATO. Initially, Clinton seemed open to the idea, but later, after consulting with his team, he rejected it. Putin emphasizes his sincerity in seeking cooperation, but acknowledges that the opportunity was missed. He states that if Clinton had shown genuine willingness, a process of reconciliation could have started, potentially leading to Russian membership in NATO. However, since that did not occur, Putin accepts the outcome and acknowledges that no need is known. The conversation between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin delved into the complexities of Russia's historical relationship with Ukraine, its grievances regarding NATO expansion, and the dynamics of global geopolitics. Putin provided extensive historical context, detailing Russia's perspective on Ukrainian identity, territorial claims, and the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse. He expressed frustration over NATO's eastward expansion despite assurances to the contrary, highlighting missed opportunities for cooperation with the West. Putin also recounted a conversation with former President Bill Clinton regarding Russia's potential membership in NATO, revealing conflicting responses that ultimately led to a breakdown in relations. Throughout the discussion, Putin emphasized Russia's desire for dialogue and cooperation while acknowledging geopolitical realities and past grievances.